You're watching Balance of Power. I'm David Weston. When David Stockman was budget director back in 1985, the national debt was approaching $2 trillion, which caused some alarm. Today, it's approaching $22 trillion, which means we are once again pressing up against the congressionally imposed limit on government borrowing. We welcome now David Stockman, President Reagan's budget director, over $16 trillion. No, that's not over $16 trillion, but I'd like it if you did have that much money. He's the author of Peak Trump, The Undrainable Swamp, and the Fantasy of MAGA. And he's also former investment banker and corporate executive. He's coming back to Bloomberg for today's conversation in chief. So welcome, David. Good to have you.
Well, it's obvious the swamp has not been drained because when we took office in January 1981, the debt was actually under $1 trillion. And the first thing, to his great regret, that Ronald Reagan had to do was ask Congress for an increase in the debt ceiling above $1 trillion. He unfortunately was never able to slow down the growth of the debt because the tax cut got too big, defense got out of control. But that's where it all started. Remember, in 1980, that $1 trillion was 30% of GDP. It had taken a long time to get to that $1 trillion mark. In fact, 38 presidents before him. Here we are today, $22 trillion, and it's actually objectively, this is the important thing, built in $40 trillion. By the end of this 10-year cycle, unless we do something to change fundamental policy, tax and spending and defense and entitlements, we'll be at $40 trillion, 140% of GDP. You can't really live with that when the baby boom's retiring and they're all going on Social Security.
Well, which raises the question, does it really matter? I mean, we were in a panic when we went to $2 trillion. Now we're at $22 trillion. The country didn't fall apart. We now have people with modern monetary theory saying it doesn't matter. And by the way, they're from the left and the right saying, you know what, as long as we're the globe's currency, we can borrow as much as we want.
That's ridiculous. That's utterly ridiculous, because if that were true, why bother with $22 trillion of debt? Let's have $50 trillion, $100 trillion. Let's dump money out of the sky from helicopters and tell everybody to have a party. Who needs to work? Just have the government or the Fed print the money. That's crazy as hell. And we've reached the point where we are today on the debt because the Fed has accommodated the Congress over and over with these easy policies that have made it possible to finance the debt at artificially low interest rates. But, you know, we have $400 trillion, we had $4.5 trillion balance sheet at the Fed, $22 trillion worldwide. It's the central banks that have enabled the politicians to pretend that there's free lunches, that fiscal doesn't matter, and that the debt can keep growing. Well, you know, it's not sustainable.
Are there two elements here? One is overall, how much are we borrowing? How far are we going in debt? The other is, what are we borrowing for?
Right.
And they're separate issues. If we were investing all of this money in profitable things, if you were a corporation and the capital investment return benefits, then it wouldn't be so bad to borrow some money.
Well, first of all, the government's borrowing money rarely uses it productively, okay? A lot of it goes to defense. We're spending way too much money on defense, and it doesn't do any good economically anyway. The rest is going to entitlements, which keep people, in dollars, but it doesn't help the economy grow over time. If we look at the private side, there's been an explosion of debt. Business debt was $10 trillion at the time of the crisis. It's $15 trillion now. What did they do with it? Most of it went into stock buybacks, M&A deals, leverage recaps, and so forth. That has not planted productive capacity for the future. So both privately and publicly, we're borrowing like there's no tomorrow to have a party today on Wall Street, a party in Washington, but where are we going to be a year, 2 years, 5 years from now when this debt is even greater and the baby boom is retiring at a rate of 10,000 a day? We're going to have 80 million people retired within a decade.
So at its base, is this really an accounting problem or even a political problem, or is it really a problem for the voters? I mean, you represented your district back in Western Virginia. You were in the House of Representatives. Michigan.
Michigan.
So if the voters wanted this fixed, they would elect people who would fix it.
Well, back then there was an honest financial market, and the voters said, we sure as hell, in 1980, when I ran for re-election the third time, don't like this 16% 4% interest rates. All right, mortgages were impossible to get. Small business was being crushed. People said change policy. That's what elected Reagan. But we've had a Fed that since then destroyed the price setting mechanism of the financial markets. They've allowed everybody to live a lie that you can have $22 trillion of debt and you only have to pay 180 basis points or something of interest because the Fed and the other central banks have suppressed interest rates. So that's why the public isn't responding, because the politicians and the public have been given totally erroneous, false price signals about borrow and spend, and you don't have to worry about it.
Are we on the cusp of an even more liberal Fed in this sense? We just heard Chairman Powell last week testify, and one of the things he was pressed on is where would the interest rate need to be to avoid inflation given where we are with employment. This is his, I thought, remarkable exchange with AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, on this question.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible that the Fed's estimates of the lowest sustainable unemployment rate may have been too high?
Absolutely. I think we've learned that it's lower than we thought, substantially lower than we thought.
So this is a Fed who's supposed to both control price stability, which is inflation, and make sure we have maximum employment. If we don't really need to worry about inflation, and we haven't for the last few years, do we have a Fed that basically has only one mandate, which is make sure everybody gets employed?
No, because the Phillips curve was never correct, and he at least admitted that it doesn't exist. And it took probably the least informed member of Congress to tease the AOC to tease that out of him. But the point is, labor markets are global. Okay, and what determines the wage rate on the margin in the world is the China price for goods, the India price for services, and as long as there's still rice paddies to be emptied in villages throughout Asia that can put workers into factories funded with cheap credit, there won't be an inflation problem. But that doesn't mean that the Fed keeps printing money and puts the interest rate practically at the running inflation rate. For 10 years, the money market rate has been about under the inflation rate measured by the CPI less food and energy. Now, that hasn't helped Main Street. That has been a gift to Wall Street. So Wall Street is up 300% from the bottom. On Main Street, we've had the weakest recovery in history. It doesn't work.
Well, take us through that exactly, because we're just on the cusp of earnings. I mean, this week we really get into it in earnest. There's a lot of earnings. If, in fact, the interest rates were higher, if the Fed did what you wanted to do, how would that benefit the C-suite? How would that benefit Main Street?
If interest rates were higher, at least there would be an honest price in the financial markets for borrowing versus not borrowing. If you had honest interest rates, I don't think the C-suites would be borrowing trillions of dollars to buy back their own stock. It's an irrational decision. Mm-hmm. They're loading up their balance sheets with debt that they're going to carry for the indefinite future in order to buy some shares back today and goose their earnings by the quarter. That isn't productive investment. So we're living a lie. That's all I can tell you. Households are borrowing too much. We had a warning in 2008. You got too much debt. Households today have $15.6 trillion of debt, trillion more than they had back then. Business has 50% more debt today than they had back then. And we don't even have to talk about the government. So this is the point. Interest rates need to reflect economic reality. And as long as they're being deeply suppressed by the Fed, you're essentially stimulating Wall Street. You're creating the greatest bubble in history. When it collapses, which it will, like 2000, like 2007, 2008, we're going to have another crisis.
Okay. Thank you so much, David. It's really good to have you here. Always is. That's former Reagan budget director David Stockman.